Welcome to History Happy Hour. Nobody is here yet, but I'm just going to start talking. We are reading Rye on the Rocks, The Tale of a Town That Resorted to Resorting by William Varrell. And all right, there I am. All right, I closed down some things and it miraculously came back. I don't know if it really had an effect or what. So, I'm Ginna Macdonald. I'm on the board of directors of the Rye Historical Society, and we just started reading this book last week, and it's kind of another look at the history of Rye as opposed to the very historical one that we just finished reading a couple weeks ago. And Debbie Toohey, our board chair, had said, oh, we should read the inside of the cover. So I'm going to read that to you before I start my chapter. The chapters are pretty short, so we can get away with this now. All right. Rye on the Rocks is the complete story of a town that was news before Plymouth was attacked by hostile Indians, defended its shores against Great Britain, and played host to presidents. It is also the story of farmers who built churches and stores, made their town a king of the Victorian resorting world, and weren't interested enough to hold a public celebration when the first transatlantic cable between Europe and the United States was landed on their very doorsteps. Read of the literary greats of the country at the Isles of Shoals, murder, courtin, and characters such as the Witch of Straws Point, who poisoned her husband's Christmas dinner, and the purveyor of wild Irish goods and molasses. From Charles I to the robber barons and Henry Ford, all have their place in this tale of a town. Not only is Rye on the Rocks a storehouse of facts linking history with today, but a living history of life in days gone by. The original glass negatives of the area's Victorian photographer have been collected from all over New England, with over 60 plates being included throughout the story. And if you're interested, underneath the promo that is on Facebook, there is a link to all of the pictures that are in the book. You not only read of the past, but view it in a collection of the best of the photographic rooms of the day, depicting the complete hotel era, transportation, architecture, shipwrecks, and entertainment. Make Rye on the Rocks the book that ties you to history as you read of cotillions and clam bakes, fires and fairs, boardwalks and buggies, the Civil War, and 19th century surf bathing, all as they directly affected the town that makes every reader wish he had seen it and every Yankee fascinated by his heritage. So, that's the inside cover. It is happy hour, history happy hour. I have my margarita right here, so take a sip. And we are going to start reading about building on the Rocks of Rye. Although early reports indicate that the original Mason settlement met with much hardship and death, it did prove much more successful than its predecessor, with each year bringing a few more hands to aid the tasks of the determined band. Whereas the original settlement had remained together to the extent of all living under one roof, the 1631 colonists spread throughout the entire area of the mouth of the Piscataqua. A certain degree of early... Whoops! Technical error. A certain degree of early prosperity is evident by the fact that, as well as engaging in extensive fishing operations, a saltworks was early built and operated by Francis Williams, and 2 sawmills were soon turning out lumber. These first colonists were also not without extensive imports from Europe. In 1631, the first beef cattle were imported from Denmark. Apple trees soon made their appearance on our soil, and the colony included an extensive common storehouse which boasted such items as a number of sets of armor, many pairs of silk hose, and probably the first musical instruments to be brought to this country. Although yet to receive any return on his investment, the new settlement gave Mason renewed hope that his latest efforts at colonization would be profitable. With great enthusiasm, he ordered a new ship to be built in England in order to transport new immigrants to his colony and return the wealth of their efforts to Europe. However, just as success appeared to be at hand, the nearly completed ship collapsed on the launching ways and had to be declared a total loss. This reversal left Mason in a great financial difficulty, and with supply and communication with the settlement at the mouth of the Piscataqua at a low ebb, Mason died in London in 1635. As a result of the lack of a common religious purpose, early New Hampshire did not enjoy the order of some of its contemporaries to the south, and was constantly at the mercy of ambitious men too radical for more solid communities. However, it did receive a small semblance of orderly government during its earliest days. In 1631, Strawberry Bank, or the Lower Plantation, became separated from the Upper Plantation of the Hiltons and Northam, now Dover. And in 1653, although the leadership of the settlement changed hands to those of Henry Jocelyn, the area now included in the towns of Newington, Greenland, Newcastle, and Rye was incorporated into the town of Portsmouth. At this time, Portsmouth's population included about 50 to 60 families. A reference to the earlier name of Strawberry Bank is found in Strawberry Patch Lane, the road running between Thompson's first settlement and the present site of Portsmouth. Evidently, the first settlers were too preoccupied with the basic needs of survival to give much importance to the claims of Richard Norton, a London barrister, who came to the settlement as an agent for Mason's widow in an attempt to salvage a portion of Mason's investment for his heirs. After a number of years of negative cooperation from the colony, it must have been a great hardship on the local inhabitants when Norton rounded up all the available cattle, approximately 100 head, and herded them to Boston, where they were sold for 25 pounds sterling each. Realizing he could gain little else from the colony, from Boston he sailed directly for England, thus temporarily severing all connections between New Hampshire and the Mason estate in England. By 1641, the people were apparently as lacking in harmony of purpose as 10 years previous. That the settlement in the midst of a great wilderness amid 12 tribes of Indians was in need of strong guidance is evidenced by the fact that in spite of the difference in their religious backgrounds in that year, by a vote of the inhabitants, the Strawberry Bank settlement became part of Norfolk County, thus being included within the state of Massachusetts. The year 1641 also saw the reappearance in the area of Captain Neal, who returned as a part of the Derby Field expedition, the first group of white men to explore the White Mountains and climb to the summit of Mount Washington. Evidently, the settlement on the Piscataqua attained a higher degree of stability under the Puritan rule of Massachusetts than it had previously experienced, for in the late 1640s we have the first record of formal land ownership in what is now Rye. These first grants appear to have been quite orderly by today's standards. William Barry received the first grant of 50 acres in what is now Rye in 1648. This was followed by similar awards to Robert Purdington and Anthony Brackett, who in 1649 also received grants in the area of Saltwater Brook. 4 years later, Thomas Walford, who had come to the area by reason of his being banished from the town of Charlestown, Massachusetts, received another grant in this same area. It is interesting to note that this brook, which was the center of activity in what is now Rye, is today but a muddy channel commonly referred to as Stink Creek, meeting the sea just north of Concord Point. It is time to take a sip because it is happy hour. Definite land grants were awarded in the 1640s. There were others living in the area purely as squatters. In 1652, a meeting was held at the home of Selectman George Walton for the purpose of examining the town book to determine who were the legal holders of real estate. Whereas the granting of land seems to have been by a very ethical process, a person could lose the land which he had settled and developed merely by being out of favor with the selectmen and having his name struck from the book. That the land now included in the present boundaries of Rye was an important part of the early settlement is illustrated by the fact that of 5 selectmen elected in 1653, 3 appear to have been residents of the Rye area. It was also the second governor, Henry Jocelyn, who gave his name to the land now known as Straw's Point. Although out of favor with his former religious affiliates, Thomas Walford was also on the 1654 committee, which assigned the inhabitants to their seats in the meeting house. Of the early settlers, most appear in later history, but the name of Purtington leaves the scene when in 1655 he sold his holdings to William Seavey. Seavey, however, was not a newcomer to the community, having been here since 1631, when he came ashore from a fishing boat and decided to remain. Another early resident was John Odiorn, who acquired the land now known as Odiorn's Point in 1667. Nevertheless, it was not until after the Revolutionary War that this point took the name of its owning family. Previous to that time, it had been known as Rendezvous Point, no doubt in reference to its being a gathering place for foreign fishing fleets. Another of the original founders was George Wallace, who with his son Ralph arrived aboard the ship Abigail in 1635. Although evidently fully accepted into the area after being banished from the Massachusetts colony in 1628, New Hampshire did not prove to be the end of Thomas Walford's problems with the law and the church. There is still on record an account of the witchcraft trial of Goodwife Walford. The terms goodwife and goodman were used in the 1600s as we would use Mr. and Mrs. today. The complainant, Susanna Trimmings, testified as follows. As I was going home on Sunday night, I heard a rustling in the bushes, which I supposed to be occasioned by swine. But presently there appeared a woman, whom I apprehended to be Goodwife Walford. She asked me to lend her a pound of cotton. I told her I had but 2 pounds of cotton, and I would not spare any to my mother. She said I had better had done it, for I was going on a great journey, but should never come back. She then left me, and I was struck with a clap of fire on the back, and she vanished toward the waterside, in my apprehension, in the shape of a cat. She had on her head a white linen hood tied under her chin, and her waistcoat and petticoat were red, with an old gown, apron, and a black hat upon her head. Her husband next testified that his wife had come home in a speechless condition and thus remained for several days, and Robert Couch further testified that Mrs. Walford was a witch, and he could prove her one. Although a sensational trial for that time, the verdict was not reached until the next session of court, when the case was decided in Mrs. Walford's favor, whereupon she sued Couch for slander, and although asking £1,000, was awarded £5 and costs. This does not seem to be the only case of local witchcraft during the days when it was commonly believed that a fork stuck into a witch's footprint or a hairpin dropped in her shadow would make her unable to move. A number of years later, a Rye family is reported to have seen their woodpile burst into flame, but when they went out to investigate, found no fire at all. That's some spooky stuff. Although settling on land that Rye was later to acquire from Hampton rather than from her northern neighbors, few of the early settlers were more ambitious than Francis Gennis, who in 1675 settled at the mouth of Cedar Swamp Run. Mr. Gennis is said to have cleared his land, built a bakery, and with a small boat distributed his baked goods to all the settlements up and down the coast as far as Boston. That this mill and bakery was quite successful is evidenced by the fact that in the spring of 1695, the chief citizens of the area entered into a contract with John Batson, millwright of Newcastle, to construct an even larger mill. Although still the day of murderous Indian raids, this contract between Batson and his employers was quite complete by today's standards. As well as receiving 20 shillings per week, Batson was to receive building materials, meat, drink, lodging, laborers, and pasturing for his horse. It is interesting to note that of the many early rye mills, although unrecognizable in its present state of remodeling, this is the only one remaining. But it's nice to see you watching. We have Adam and Andrea and Rolf. Hello. All right. Another one of the early pioneers to settle this southern section of Rye was Joseph Philbrick, who came to this country in 1630 from Lincolnshire, England. Although originally settling in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1643 he became a resident of the part of Rye then included within the boundaries of Hampton, like John Locke. The Philbricks settled on common land without permission, and in an attempt to be dissuaded from the move, had their crops burned a number of times. However, the Philbricks were able to settle their differences with the law with their land, which was gained by squatters' rights, becoming the site of Rye Beach's most famous hotel, which was built by later generations of this same family. Of the early settlers, the Perkins seem to be exceptions in that they came to the area chiefly as a result of religious persecution in England and gained clear title to their land before settlement. They are also exceptions in that they did not stick solely to farming and fishing as a way of gaining a livelihood. Throughout the 19th century, Perkins is said to have mined iron ore on his Rye farm. Although the majority of this ore was said to have been transported to the Saugus Iron Works in a shallop at the time of the Revolutionary War, Perkins is said to have transported ore to the Amesbury Iron Works in a wheelbarrow. Wow. However, easy for the early settlers to acquire land. It was quite another story for claimants of the original grant. In 1655, Robert Tufton, the neighbor of John Mason, became sole heir to his uncle's claims in New Hampshire, and beginning at that time, initiated a long legal battle in an attempt to gain control of his uncle's former holdings. Although the return of the monarchy in Charles II was a great help toward refuting a claim against Puritan Massachusetts, it was not Tufton's claim to New Hampshire. No, it was not until 1664 that a commission was appointed by the king to investigate Tufton's claim to New Hampshire. This commission attempted to establish a government in New Hampshire free from the jurisdiction of Massachusetts, but this plan did not prove successful in the execution. However, undaunted by this initial failure, Tufton petitioned the British Parliament a second time in 1677. At this time, Massachusetts was requested to send agents to England to answer Tufton's charges. It must be remembered that the claims were further complicated by the fact that Jonathan Wheelwright had purchased much of the disputed land from a group of Sachem Indians. Although Tufton supported his claims with the statement that Mason had invested over £22,000 in his colony, and at this time did not attempt the right of government over the lands, he was defeated a second time when Parliament decided that title to the land was a problem between Tufton and the local courts. Possibly a firm believer in the saying that the third time never fails, in 1679, Tufton went over to the head of Parliament and petitioned the king directly to appoint a government to have jurisdiction over all land claimed by him. Going upstairs was Tufton's move for initial success, for on September 18th, 1679, New Hampshire was constituted a separate province with a government vested in a president and appointed by the king and an assembly appointed by the people. On January 1st, 1680, Edward Randolph arrived in Portsmouth, with the commission making the new government official, and Newcastle, of which Rye was then a part, was once more made a part of Portsmouth. Have a sip. Wet your whistle. All right. Although 1680 marks the end of Tufton's attempts to regain his land via the British courts, as a result of the hostility of the local inhabitants, he never became lord and master of the seacoast communities and fared little better in the interior. Over a period of the next 40 years, New Hampshire fell under the jurisdiction of both New York and Massachusetts, but it was becoming necessary to divert most of the efforts of the day to the threat of the French and the hostile Indians, with little attention for a fortune-seeking nephew. And that is the end of the story of settling, building on the Rocks of Rye. So we hope you'll join us next week. Thank you for joining me here today. Next week, somebody will be continuing with When Saltwater Brook Ran Red to the Sea. So this is a really fascinating way to kind of fill in the blanks of the other history that we've known. So hope you can join us again next week. Thanks for coming. Have a good night.